There is a sound in the Arctic, a silence so profound it has weight. It is a landscape of white, of jagged blue ice, and of shadows that stretch for 1,000 years. It is here, in this frozen cathedral at the top of the world, that one of history's most enduring and terrifying mysteries was born. It is a story not just of exploration, but of desperation, not just of death, but of something else, something that followed them into the white. This is not merely a tale of a failed expedition. This is the story of the Frozen Scream. On the morning of May 19, 1845, the River Thames was a spectacle of pride and pageantry. Two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were moored at Greenhithe, their black hulls freshly painted, their brass gleaming. They were not ordinary vessels. The Erebus and Terror were beasts, engineered for destruction, veterans of the Antarctic. Now, they were bound for the Arctic, on a mission to conquer the last great geographical prize, the Northwest Passage. And at their helm was a man knighted for his service, a man of the Royal Navy's Old Guard, Sir John Franklin. Franklin was 59 years old. To some, he was a hero, the man who ate his boots on a previous grueling overland expedition. To others in the Admiralty, he was, past his prime, a man chosen for his placid temperament and public appeal, not his vigor. But the ships themselves were the true marvels of the age. They were fitted with revolutionary steam locomotives, their engines converted to drive propellers, allowing them to churn through ice-clogged waters where sailing ships would be trapped. Their holds were packed with a 3-year supply of provisions, 8,000 tins of preserved food, 1,000 pounds of candles, a 1,200-volume library, and even a hand organ that played 50 hymns. It was a floating piece of Victorian England, an island of civilization believing it could tame the savage ice. And the crew, 129 souls, officers, marines, sailors, and 2 civilians, an ice master and a Scottish naturalist. They were the best of the Royal Navy, eager for glory, for the prize money, for a place in the history books. As the ships sailed, the crowds cheered, and the band played. None of them could have imagined the truth, that they were not just sailing into the ice, they were sailing into the mouth of a nightmare. For weeks, the expedition made good progress. They were spotted by whaling ships in Baffin Bay in late July, a final, fleeting glimpse of the world they knew. Then the Erebus and Terror turned west, into the labyrinth of the Canadian Arctic archipelago. And then, they vanished. The silence that descended was as absolute as the Arctic winter. For 2 years back in England, there was concern, but not yet panic. They had provisions for 3 after all. But by 1848, the silence had become a roar of anxiety. Lady Jane Franklin, Sir John's formidable wife, began a relentless campaign. She begged, she pleaded, she funded her own searches. She would not let her husband be forgotten. The first clues were fragments, whispered by the ice over a decade. An Inuit hunter on King William Island, a place the Inuit themselves called a starving place, found something strange. A piece of wood, splintered, with metal nails. He told a British search party of meeting a group of white men dragging a boat south, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. They were, he said, searching for seal holes. They bought a seal from him with a few coins and then moved on into the white. The search party, led by John Ray, heard more. Tales from other Inuit of piles of bones, of knives stained with blood, and of a story so horrifying it was dismissed in England as savage slander. The Inuit said the white men had been reduced to the last taboo. They had eaten the dead. The Victorian public was appalled. Charles Dickens himself wrote scathing rebuttals, defending the honor of the British sailor. They could not, would not, believe it. But the land held its evidence close. It wasn't until 1859, more than a decade after Franklin's disappearance, that the grim truth began to solidify. A search expedition led by Francis McClintock found a cairn on King William Island. Inside, a single rusted cylinder, and inside that, a note. It was the only written record ever recovered from the expedition, and it told a story of swift and terrible demise. The first part of the note, dated May 28, 1847, was optimistic. It stated that all was well, that they had wintered at Beechey Island, and that Sir John Franklin was in command. But the paper had margins, and in those margins, scrawled in a different hand around the edges, was a second note, dated April 25, 1848. It was a message from the grave. The ships, it said, had been trapped in the ice for a year and a half. Sir John Franklin was dead, having passed on June 11, 1847. 24 officers and crew had also died. The survivors, 105 souls, were abandoning the ships under the command of Captain Crozier. They were, the note ended, starting on tomorrow, the 26th, for Back's Fish River, a desperate 600-mile trek to a remote fur-trading outpost. It was a death march, but the note was only the beginning of the horror. As search parties scoured the coast of King William Island, they began to find the bones. A skeleton here, a skull there. And then, in the 1980s and 1990s, forensic science finally gave the dead a voice. Scientists exhumed the 3 perfectly preserved bodies from the expedition's first winter camp on Beechey Island. They were young men, buried in the frozen ground, their graves orderly, their deaths likely from pneumonia or tuberculosis. But they were just the prologue. The bodies found along the retreat south told a different story. The bones showed cut marks, precise, deliberate slices made by metal blades. Not the haphazard gnawing of animals, but the systematic butchery of human beings. The stories the Inuit had told were true. The Franklin expedition, in its final agonizing days, had resorted to cannibalism. It wasn't a frenzied act of madness, but a calculated, horrifying strategy for survival. They were boiling the flesh from the bones of their comrades, cracking the long bones to get at the marrow, in a last desperate attempt to fuel their broken bodies. But why? They had tinned food. The answer was found in the very technology meant to save them. The lead solder used to seal their state-of-the-art food cans was of poor quality. It leached into the food, poisoning them slowly, inexorably. The men were suffering from lead poisoning, which causes weakness, confusion, paranoia, and madness. They were starving, freezing, and being driven insane by the very provisions that were supposed to be their salvation. Now, imagine the scene. The year is 1848. The 2 ships, the Erebus and the Terror, are utterly, hopelessly trapped. The ice is not just a sheet, it is a mountain range, a crushing, groaning force that has gripped their hulls for 19 months. The world outside is a monochrome of white and blue, the wind a constant, screaming companion. Inside, the world is dark, cold, and smells of damp wood, coal smoke, and fear. The men are listless, their gums bleeding, their minds clouded. Their beloved commander, Franklin, is dead, sealed in a coffin and buried somewhere deep in the ice below them. Now Captain Francis Crozier, a seasoned and brilliant Irishman, makes the only choice left. He orders the ships abandoned. The sight must have been surreal. Over 100 men, their uniforms in tatters, dragging lifeboats on sledges across the jagged, chaotic ice. These boats were not designed for overland travel. They were monstrously heavy, laden with useless trinkets, silver cutlery, china plates, the ship's Bible. Why? Perhaps it was the lead-addled mind clinging to the last shreds of civilization. Perhaps it was a desperate hope that they could still sail to safety if they reached open water. They trudged south towards the mouth of the Back River, a landscape so barren it offered no shelter, no food, no hope. They began to die, first in ones and twos, then in groups. And as they died, the others did what they had to do. The evidence is etched into the bones. The final campsites were not just scenes of death, but of processing. But the horror deepens. In 2014 and 2016, the wrecks of Erebus and Terror were finally found, lying on the ocean floor, astonishingly well preserved. Erebus lay in deeper water, its structure largely intact. But Terror was found in a bay off King William Island, its hatches closed, as if deliberately sealed. Some archaeologists now posit a terrifying new theory. What if not all of the men abandoned the ships? What if a small, desperate group stayed behind, trapped not by ice but by their own failing bodies and minds? They would have been sealed in their iron-hard wooden tomb, listening to the wind howl, the ice groan, waiting for a thaw that would never come for them. The ships, once symbols of imperial power, became their coffins. And then, there are the Inuit stories, the ones that go beyond the physical evidence and speak of a different kind of haunting. They told of finding a final large camp on the shore. They described a tent, and inside, a pile of skeletons. And among them, a large man, his body positioned oddly, with a pile of watches and other valuables beside him. They spoke of finding a lifeboat on a sledge, pointing back the way they had come, as if someone had given up on the south and decided to return to the ships. And most chillingly, they spoke of the state of the bodies. They said the meat had been cut away, yes, but in a way that suggested the men had not just been eating for survival. They described a shambles, a place of systematic butchery. The line between survival and something darker, something more ritualistic, begins to blur in the endless twilight of the Arctic. The silence that followed the final camp was not an empty one. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of 129 men, their final moments lost to the wind. For over a century, the Franklin expedition existed as a grim folktale, a cautionary legend of hubris and the unforgiving power of nature. But the Arctic was not done telling its story. The discovery of the two shipwrecks, Erebus in 2014 and Terror in 2016, did not provide simple answers. Instead, they deepened the mystery, offering new, tangible relics that whispered of those final, desperate days. The wreck of HMS Erebus was found in Wilmot and Crampton Bay, its decks strewn with artifacts as if frozen in a moment of sudden abandonment. But it was the discovery of HMS Terror, lying pristine and upright in the deep, cold water of Terror Bay, that sent a shiver through the archaeological world. Her masts were snapped, but her hull was perfectly sealed. It was a time capsule. Diving expeditions revealed cabins with closed drawers, beds still made, and plates neatly stacked in the mess. It looked less like a ship that had been hastily evacuated, and more like one that had been gently laid to rest. This preservation has fueled a compelling and haunting theory. What if a skeleton crew remained on the Terror, perhaps too sick or too loyal to leave? They would have lived out their final days in the belly of their ship, a ghost crew waiting for a spring that would never melt the ice around them, their world shrinking to the creaking of timbers and the slow, relentless creep of the cold. But the most profound and personal clues have come not from the ships, but from the bones scattered along the coast of King William Island. The analysis of these remains tells a story that is both scientifically clear and humanly devastating. The cut marks on the bones are one thing, evidence of a survival strategy born of utter desperation. But other bones reveal a more intimate violence. A skull shows a percussive fracture, likely from a gunshot. Was it mercy? Was it conflict over the last scraps of food? Or was it the final, terrible result of lead-induced psychosis, where comrades became strangers, and then threats? The high levels of lead found in the bones confirm the poison was in their systems, clouding their judgment, amplifying their paranoia, and ensuring their march was not just one of physical starvation, but of collective mental collapse. They were not themselves in the end. The legacy of the Franklin expedition is a complex tapestry woven from imperial ambition, technological arrogance, and raw human endurance. It is a story that forced Victorian England to confront an uncomfortable truth, that its finest men, equipped with its greatest technology, could be reduced to the most primal state by a landscape that refused to be conquered. The frozen scream is not a single sound, but a chorus. It is the groan of the ice crushing the Terror's hull. It is the whisper of the wind over the graves on Beechy Island. It is the silent, desperate prayer of Captain Crozier as he made the decision to lead his men into the white. And it is the final, unanswered question that hangs over the pristine wreck of the Terror. What truly happened in those dark, sealed cabins in the long, lonely months after the main party left? The Arctic keeps its secrets well, but the echoes of this tragedy remain, a chilling reminder that some stories are never truly over, They are merely waiting, preserved in the ice, to be heard.